What are Zainichi Koreans? Have you ever heard this term before? Zainichi Koreans are Koreans that live in Japan whose ancestors moved to Japan during the Japanese colonial era. Did you know almost 90,000 Zainichi Koreans moved to North Korea from 1956 to as late as 1984? Why did they go there, and what happened to them? How did so many Koreans end up in Japan in the first place? Remember that during Japanese imperialism, many Koreans were displaced and sent throughout Japanese colonial territory to work in labor camps, more so during the wartime mobilization years. Therefore, thousands of Koreans were displaced to Japan. Many Koreans were in Japan for up to 35 years. They grew up there and started families of their own. After World War II, many traveled back home, but not all were able to return to Korea. Thousands were essentially stuck in Japan as Korean citizens. Discrimination continued, and they couldn't receive government aid because they did not have Japanese citizenship. Thus, repatriation became a more and more pressing need. That was the situation in Japan. Jump back over to the Korean peninsula. In 1948, Korea was divided into North and South. So how did this affect Koreans in Japan? Well, the large Korean population in Japan became divided also. The Mindan, South Korean affiliated, and Chongryon, North Korean affiliated groups formed and lobbied for numbers. Through the Chongryon group, North Korea was able to spread a lot of propaganda and gain popularity. Also keep in mind that the economic status of the two Koreas were vastly different. North Korea, through the help of the Soviet Union, was able to quickly rebuild after the Korean War and had a better economy than South Korea at the time. South Korea appeared to be struggling, but under Park Chung-hee, they miraculously turned their economy around. Unfortunately, it was too late for many Zainichi who had already returned to North Korea. Unsurprising to us, life in North Korea wasn't anything the Zainichi had been promised. Due to their ties to Japan, Zainichi were limited to the hostile class. When North Korea suffered their Great Famine in the 90s, many Zainichi were the first affected. A good voice for the Zainichi story comes from the documentary Dear Pyongyang. This documentary was made by a Zainichi girl whose father sent her 3 older brothers back to North Korea, and how the move drastically changed their lives compared to the life she lived growing up in Japan. She supposes that her brothers and their families were only able to survive due to the packages her mother frequently sent them. The groups I presented to did not have any ties to Korea, and therefore had little knowledge about Korean history. Much of the time spent presenting was used to explain historical events from the early 1900s, events that led up to the circumstances Zainichi Koreans found themselves in. A few of the people presented to were born around the time of the Korean War, and shared some prejudices they learned while growing up and from media sources that they watch and listen to as they are retired. A couple people had an interest in Korean language and culture, so it spurred an engaging discussion about how North Korea was interacting with its neighboring countries.